The air in the garage smelled of motor oil and dust, a familiar mix that Nathan had grown accustomed to. It was his refuge, the only space in the house where he could exist without pretense. Outside, the hum of crickets filled the evening, a soft contrast to the occasional clang of metal as he tinkered with an old radio. Nathan preferred being here, alone, rather than inside where his mother, Diane, and her new husband, Mark, played at being a picture-perfect couple. It had been just the two of them for so long, Nathan and his mom, until Mark arrived. A man in his early 40s, Mark was effortlessly charismatic, the kind of guy who never had to try too hard. His presence changed the house, not in any overtly hostile way, but in a way that unsettled Nathan. At first, it was the small things. Mark rearranging the furniture, claiming he was making the space more functional. The way he called Nathan kid like they had some kind of unspoken bond. The way Diane softened when Mark was around, laughing at jokes that weren't all that funny. Nathan told himself he didn't care. He was 18, almost out of high school. In a few months, he'd be gone, off to college, leaving all of this behind. But there was something about Mark that kept Nathan's thoughts circling back. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. He had tried to ignore it. The way his pulse quickened when Mark walked around in a towel, the way his stomach twisted when Mark stood too close. These were thoughts he buried deep, refusing to acknowledge them. He had spent years coming to terms with his own identity, and this, whatever this was, felt like a betrayal of that progress. The garage was his escape, the one place Mark never entered. Or so he thought. That night, as Nathan adjusted the frequency knob on the radio, voices from the house filtered through the open window. His mother's laughter was soft, distant. Then another voice, Mark's lower, quieter. Nathan wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something in Mark's tone made him pause. "I know. I miss you too," Mark murmured. A pause. "Yeah, I'll see you soon." Nathan's fingers tightened around the knob. There was nothing inherently suspicious about the words. It could have been anyone, a friend, a coworker. But the way Mark spoke, his voice dropping into something more intimate, sent a shiver down Nathan's spine. Footsteps. The back door creaked open, and before Nathan could compose himself, Mark stepped into the garage. "Still at it?" Mark leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. The dim light cast shadows across his face, making it harder for Nathan to read his expression. Nathan cleared his throat. "Yeah, just fixing this old thing." Mark nodded, his gaze sweeping the garage before settling back on Nathan. "You spent a lot of time out here. It's quiet." "That it is?" Mark's lips quirked into something like a smile, but there was an edge to it, something unreadable. "Not a bad place to clear your head." Nathan forced himself to look back at the radio, pretending to be engrossed in its circuitry. His heart was still pounding from what he had overheard, but Mark gave no indication that he had noticed. "So, what's the verdict?" Mark asked after a moment. Nathan blinked. "What?" Mark gestured at the radio. "Think you can fix it?" Yeah, just need some rewiring." Mark nodded slowly, as if considering something else entirely. "You're good with your hands?" Nathan swallowed. The words were innocent, but his mind twisted them into something else, something dangerous. A silence stretched between them, thick enough that Nathan thought Mark would hear his heartbeat. He felt pinned under the weight of Mark's gaze, though he couldn't explain why. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Mark pushed off the workbench. "Well, don't stay up too late," he said, already heading for the door. Nathan barely managed a nod before Mark disappeared into the night. Alone again, he exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a screwdriver. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was overthinking it. But deep down, he knew something had shifted, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. Nathan told himself he was imagining things. The moment in the garage had been nothing, a brief, awkward conversation. Mark hadn't done anything, hadn't said anything incriminating. And yet, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken had passed between them. He tried to act normal, to convince himself that the strange tension was all in his head, but Mark made that impossible. Over the next few days, Mark seemed to be everywhere. It started small. He would linger in the kitchen when Nathan came to grab a drink, asking casual questions about school or his plans for the summer. At dinner, he held eye contact a second too long, his expression unreadable. Nathan caught him watching sometimes, just fleeting glances, but enough to make his skin prickle with awareness. And then, there were the moments that weren't so subtle. One evening, Diane had gone to visit a friend, leaving Nathan and Mark alone in the house. Nathan had retreated to the garage, as he always did, hoping to avoid any unnecessary interaction. But half an hour later, the door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside. "Thought I'd find you here," Mark said, closing the door behind him. Nathan didn't look up from the wires he was twisting together. "Yeah, just keeping busy." Mark leaned against the workbench, arms crossed over his chest. "You always this quiet?" Nathan exhaled sharply. "Depends on the company." Mark chuckled, low and easy. "Fair enough." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Nathan could feel Mark's gaze on him, studying him, like he was trying to decipher something. His pulse quickened, but he refused to acknowledge it. "You ever think about getting out of here?" Mark asked suddenly. Nathan frowned, finally glancing up. "What do you mean?" "This town. This house. Everything." Mark tilted his head slightly. "You ever feel like you're just waiting for your real life to start?" Nathan hesitated. "Yeah, I guess." Mark smirked, like he had already known the answer. "I felt the same way when I was your age. Wanted more than what I had. Wanted something different." Nathan swallowed hard. There was something about the way Mark said different that made his skin heat. He turned back to the wires in his hands, pretending to be focused, but his fingers trembled slightly. "You're good with your hands," Mark said, his voice quieter now. Nathan froze. It was the second time Mark had said it. The first time, he had ignored it, pushed it aside as meaningless. But this time, the way Mark's voice dipped, the way the words settled in the air between them, it felt like something else. Nathan forced himself to breathe. He wasn't imagining this. He couldn't be. "I try," he muttered, trying to keep his tone even. Mark didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, plucked the screwdriver from Nathan's grip, and turned it over in his hands, testing its weight. His fingers brushed against Nathan's in the process, just barely, but enough. Enough to send a current up Nathan's arm. Nathan swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Mark's face. If this was a test, he was failing. Mark studied him for a beat longer before setting the screwdriver down. "You should take a break," he said, his voice still low, still unreadable. "I'm fine," Nathan said quickly. Mark's smirk deepened, but he pushed off the workbench and stretched, his t-shirt lifting slightly, revealing the taut muscles of his abdomen. Nathan's gaze flickered down before he could stop himself. "All right, suit yourself," Mark said, his tone amused. He turned to leave, but at the last second, he hesitated. "Oh, and Nathan?" Nathan looked up, heart hammering. "Maybe don't work too hard. Wouldn't want you getting distracted." And then he was gone, leaving Nathan alone, breathless, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was right. This wasn't his imagination. It was real, and it was only getting worse. Nathan had spent years believing he understood himself, his desires, his boundaries, the kind of person he wanted to be. But now, as he lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. Mark's words from the night before still clung to him, looping in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. Asterisk, wouldn't want you getting distracted. Asterisk, he had barely slept, his thoughts restless and tangled. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mark, smirking, watching, waiting. And worst of all, he saw himself, wanting something he had no right to want. By the time morning arrived, Nathan had made a decision. He would avoid Mark completely. If this was some kind of game, he wouldn't play. If Mark was testing him, searching for weakness, he wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Whatever tension existed between them, whatever this was, Nathan would starve it out, let it wither and die before it became something neither of them could take back. But avoidance was easier in theory than in practice. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. At breakfast, Mark sat across from him at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as if nothing had changed. Diane moved around the kitchen, humming to herself as she fixed toast. Nathan kept his eyes on his plate, forcing himself to eat despite the tightness in his stomach. "Anything interesting happen in the garage last night?" Mark asked casually. Nathan's fork paused midair. He forced himself to breathe. "Nope." Mark took another sip of coffee, studying Nathan over the rim of his mug. "Seemed like you were deep in thought when I left." Nathan's grip tightened on his fork. If Diane noticed the tension, she didn't comment on it. She just placed a plate of eggs in front of Mark and kissed him on the cheek. Nathan looked away. This was wrong. Not just what had happened in the garage, but the whole situation. Mark was playing with fire, and Nathan was standing too close to the flames. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. That afternoon, Nathan stayed in his room, headphones on, pretending to be occupied with schoolwork. He ignored the occasional footsteps outside his door, ignored the awareness prickling under his skin whenever Mark moved through the house. Hours passed, and Nathan convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, he had been overthinking everything. And then came the message. A simple buzz from his phone, a text from an unknown number. "Come to the garage. Now." Nathan stared at the screen, his pulse hammering. He didn't need to ask who it was. His first instinct was to ignore it, to delete the message, pretend he never saw it, and go on with his life. But something deeper, something darker, pushed against his better judgment. His feet carried him downstairs before he even made the conscious decision to move. The house was quiet. Diane had gone out again, leaving just the two of them behind. Nathan stepped into the garage, the dim light casting long shadows across the space. Mark was already there, leaning against the workbench, arms crossed. He looked amused. "Didn't think you'd come," Mark said. Nathan exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" Mark tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "I wanted to see something." Nathan swallowed. "See what?" Mark pushed off the workbench and closed the distance between them in 2 slow steps. Nathan didn't move, didn't breathe. Mark reached out, his fingertips barely grazing Nathan's wrist before pulling back, like he was waiting for a reaction. A test. Nathan knew he should step away, knew he should say something, asterisk anything asterisk, to end this before it crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But he didn't. He stood there, heart pounding, rooted in place as Mark leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. "I knew it," Mark murmured. Nathan felt his whole body go rigid. Asterisk knew asterisk what? Mark's smirk deepened. "That you wouldn't stop me." The word sent a sharp jolt through Nathan's system, like an exposed wire sparking to life. And in that moment, whether it was anger, desire, or something more dangerous, he realized that Mark wasn't entirely wrong.